$5 for the boys. I can use these two. You can keep the girls. Those were the words that made 10-year-old Clara's fist fly straight into a grown man's wrist. She was 90 pounds soaking wet, standing on an auction platform in the middle of a Wyoming blizzard, watching strangers bid on her siblings like they were livestock. The orphanage reverend smiled that greasy smile of his and told the crowd the truth. These children were not real siblings, just strays, merchandise that failed to sell. But Clara made him a promise right then and there. We stay together, or we do not go at all. That is when a stranger stepped out of the crowd. A broken rancher with haunted eyes and $250 in his pocket. He did not ask how much work they could do. He did not poke or inspect them. He asked one simple question that changed everything. How much for all 5 of them? What happened next will shatter your heart and then piece it back together again. The lesson. Family is not about blood. It is about who chooses to show up for you day after day, even when it is hard. The value. This story reminds us that no matter how broken we feel, the right people can help us rebuild. And sometimes, saving someone else is the first step to saving ourselves. The meaning. We are never truly unwanted. Sometimes we are just waiting for the right person to finally see our worth. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment and tell me, have you ever been chosen by someone when you felt invisible? Hit that subscribe button and stay with me for more stories that remind us why love always wins. $5 for the boys, the farmer said, grabbing Sam's arm. I can use these two. You can keep the girls. Clara's fist made contact with his wrist, her instincts moving faster than her thoughts. Let go of him. The farmer lurched back, his surprise quickly souring into anger. Why, you little... Touch my brother again and I will break every one of your fingers. She meant it. Each word was a promise. 10 years old and 90 pounds soaking wet, Clara Mae Dawson would have fought the entire crowd to keep her family from being torn apart. Sam trembled behind her. Tommy was crying softly. Josie had become very still, the kind of quiet that usually came right before she tried to run. And Emmy. Emmy just stared with those gray eyes of hers that always seemed to see too much. Get that child under control, the farmer growled at Reverend Cutter, or I will handle it myself. The Reverend stepped forward, his fine black coat a stark shape against the white snow. The smile on his face made Clara's skin crawl. Now, Clara Mae, we have talked about this kind of behavior. We are staying together, all 5 of us. That is not how this works, my dear. You are orphans. You will go where you are told. Then you will place us all together, or you will not place us at all. Reverend Cutter's smile grew strained. He faced the crowd and spread his arms wide like he was delivering a Sunday sermon. As you can see, the girl has plenty of spirit. It is misguided, of course. These children are not true siblings, merely strays who ended up on the same orphan train. There is no real need for them to remain a group. We are a family, Clara insisted. You are nothing. Cutter's voice lost all its sugary sweetness. You are unclaimed children that nobody wanted. You are merchandise that has failed to sell. That is all you are. Tommy's wail sliced through the cold air. He was 5 years old, clutching his blanket and crying with the heartbreak of a child who had lost his entire world. Mama, I want my mama. The sound shattered Clara's heart. Tommy's mother had been gone for 2 years, but he still called for her in his sleep. Shush, Tommy, I am right here. Josie put her arms around the small boy, holding him tight. It will be all right. Clara is going to make it all right. Clara wished she shared Josie's confidence. $10 for the boys, another farmer called out, stepping from the crowd. They look sturdy enough. I will work that softness right out of them. I will take the girls, too, a woman shouted. I'm in need of help in the kitchen. The blonde one appears healthy enough. 15 for just the oldest boy. 24. Stop! Clara screamed the word. Stop! 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 We are not for sale. We are people. Reverend Cutter's hand clamped hard over her mouth. That is enough. His fingers dug into her jaw. One more sound from you and you will ride in the wagon all by yourself. Do you understand me? Clara bit him. Hard. Cutter snatched his hand back, cursing as blood welled up from the bite mark. His face twisted not in pain, but in pure rage. You vicious little animal! He raised his hand to strike her. Clara did not even flinch. She had been hit before by the matrons at the orphanage, by potential families who found her to be too much trouble. She had been hit by men who believed children should be silent and grateful for any scrap they were given. She braced for the impact. It never landed. A hand shot out and caught Cutter's wrist in midair. It was a large, calloused hand, strong enough to halt the Reverend's arm as if it were a twig. That is enough of that. Clara looked up. The man was tall and weathered, maybe 40 years old, maybe more. It was hard to say with the snow dusting his dark hair and the shadows beneath his gray eyes. He wore a rancher's coat that was well made but showed its age. He held Cutter's wrist in a casual grip that suggested he could snap it without breaking a sweat. Mr. Harlan, Cutter's voice turned slick and oily. I did not see you standing there. Obviously, the man named Harlan said, releasing the Reverend's wrist. Do you often make a habit of striking children, Reverend? The girl bit me. She drew blood. Sounds to me like she had a good reason. Cutter's face turned a blotchy red. These orphans are my legal charge. How I choose to discipline them is my business alone. Not anymore. The words fell into the quiet crowd like heavy stones dropped in a calm pond. I beg your pardon? Cutter blinked, confused. I am taking them. Harlan's eyes moved over the 5 children. All of them. Clara felt the air catch in her throat. She heard Josie's sharp gasp behind her. Sam whimpered in confusion. Tommy's crying trailed off into shaky hiccups. Mr. Harlan, you must be joking. Cutter tried to laugh it off. You, taking in children? 5 of them, at that. Do I look like I'm joking? He did not. He looked like a man carved from the same hard rock as the mountains, cold, unmoving, and completely serious. You are a single man, Cutter argued. You have no wife, no experience raising a child. The placement board would never give its approval. How much? What did you say? How much do you want for all 5 of them? You name your price. The entire crowd was now completely silent. It seemed like even the wind had stopped to listen. Cutter's expression changed. Clara watched as greed fought a brief battle with his outrage, and greed won easily. Well, there are certain fees involved, of course. Transportation, paperwork. The standard placement fee is $10 per child, but considering the unique circumstances, he paused, doing the math in his head. $200 for the whole lot. Someone in the crowd gasped loudly. $200 was a small fortune, more money than most folks earned in an entire year. Harlan reached inside his coat. Wait, Clara found her voice. Wait, you cannot just... He pulled out a thick leather wallet, counted out the bills with steady fingers, and pushed them into Cutter's hand. 200, plus another 50 for your troubles. His eyes locked with Cutter's. And for making sure any difficult paperwork just disappears. Cutter's fingers folded greedily around the cash. It is a pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Harlan. This is not business, Harlan said, turning his attention to Clara. This is family. He held his hand out to her, palm up, as an offering. Clara just stared at it. What do you want with us? She demanded. I want to take you all someplace warm. Why? Because it is freezing out here and you are all shivering. That is not a real answer. No, he said, agreeing with her. It is not. But it is the only one I have for you right now. You can come with me, and I will explain everything on the way. Or you can stay here and let this reverend sell you off one by one. The choice is yours. Clara's mind was spinning. This had to be a trick. Men with money did not buy orphans because they were kind. They bought them for cheap labor, or to show off, or for worse things that she had heard the older girls whispering about. But if she said no, she would have to watch Sam be dragged away. She would see her family shattered, and everything she had fought so hard to protect would vanish like snow in the springtime. Clara. Sam's small hand found hers. I am scared. She looked down at her brother, who was 8 years old and far too skinny, with eyes that had lost their sparkle after their parents died. She looked over at Josie, who was still holding Tommy, both of them watching her with a desperate kind of hope. She looked at Emmy, silent little Emmy, who never asked for a thing because she learned a long time ago that asking only led to being let down. They were all counting on her to make the right choice, right here, right now. Clara took Mr. Harlan's hand. His grip was strong but gentle and surprisingly warm against the cold. Smart girl, he said in a low voice. Let us get all of you out of this weather. The wagon was covered, thank heavens. A canvas tarp was stretched over wooden hoops, which kept the biting wind out. Harlan lifted Tommy inside first, then Josie, then Sam. Emmy scrambled in by herself before anyone could offer to help her. Clara paused at the edge of the wagon. Having second thoughts? Harlan asked. More like 100 of them. She looked closely at his face, trying to find a single clue about what he really wanted. You just paid $250 for 5 children you do not even know. That is crazy. I suppose it is. People do not do things like that. Some people do. Why? Harlan was quiet for a long moment. Snowflakes collected on the brim of his hat and on the shoulders of his coat. 25 years ago, he said at last, I had a brother. His name was Daniel. He was 12. Clara waited for him to continue. There was a blizzard, he said, a bad one, much worse than this. We got separated from our folks, lost out in the snow. Harlan's jaw clenched. I was 15, old enough to have known better. Old enough to have saved him. What happened? I did not. The 2 words hung in the freezing air between them. By the time I found help, Daniel was gone. He had frozen just 10 feet from a little line shack that I never even knew was there. Harlan's voice was steady when he spoke, but the look in his eyes cracked through his stone-like exterior. For 25 years, I have wondered what might have been different if someone had helped us. If just one person had seen 2 kids in trouble and decided to do something. So we are just a way for you to feel better, maybe. Or maybe you are just 5 kids who are in desperate need of a home, and I am just a man who has too much house and not enough people living in it. He offered her his hand again to help her into the wagon. Does the reason really matter, if the outcome is the same? Clara thought about that. She thought about all the reasons people had given for taking in orphans, like free help, or tax money, or showing everyone what good Christians they were. None of those reasons ever made a place better or worse. The only thing that ever mattered was what happened next. I suppose not, she said. She took his hand and let him help her up into the wagon. The ranch was 20 miles to the north. That meant 20 miles of frozen road, a wind that hollered, and snow so thick it felt like the whole world had disappeared. Clara sat up front with Heron, watching him handle the horses. Behind them, her brothers and sisters were buried in blankets, quiet as animals sleeping through winter. Tommy had finally cried himself to sleep. Josie was humming a soft tune, one their mother used to sing. Sam had not said a word since they left the auction, and Emmy sat by herself, watching the white landscape with those strange gray eyes of hers. The little one, Heron said after a long, quiet spell. The girl with the dark hair. What is her story, Clara? Clara glanced over her shoulder. She does not have one, or if she does, she's not telling it. We found her at the orphanage about a year ago. Someone just left her on the front steps like a parcel. She does not talk much. She does not trust much. Neither do I, Heron said. Fair enough. Fair. He clicked the reins, pushing the horses to move a little faster. This storm is getting worse. We need to make up some time. Clara pulled her thin coat tighter around herself. Even with the wagon's canvas cover, the cold seeped in. It gnawed right down to her bones. Here. Heron shrugged out of his heavy leather coat and draped it across her shoulders. We cannot have you freezing before we even arrive. What about you? She asked. I am used to it. The coat was heavy and warm. It smelled of leather and horses and something else, maybe tobacco or wood smoke. It smelled like safety. Clara hated how much she wanted to curl up inside of it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He replied, "You seem to ask a lot of questions. Is that a problem?" "No, it means your mind is working. I would rather have that than someone who just follows orders blindly." Clara filed that piece of information away. It was something useful to know about this strange man who bought 5 orphans as if they were actually worth something. "At the auction," she started slowly, "when that man Cutter was about to hit me, you stopped him." "I did," he confirmed. "You did not have to." "I know." "Why?" Heron was silent for a moment. The horses just plodded through the deepening snow, their breath turning to steam in the cold air. "When I was 15, he said at last, "after my brother Daniel died, I spent many years being angry. I was angry at God, at my parents, at myself, and at every single person who could have helped but did not. And somewhere in all that time, I realized the anger was not hurting anyone but me. So I made a choice. Every time I see someone about to get hurt, someone I can help, I help. It does not matter who they are or what they have done. I help because nobody helped Daniel." Clara took this in. She decided it was either the most honest thing an adult had ever told her, or the most carefully crafted lie. Only time would tell which it was. "I am not going to trust you," she said bluntly. "Not yet, maybe not ever. I have trusted people before, and it has never ended well." "That is fine," he said. "It does not bother you." "Why would it? Trust has to be earned. I have not earned anything from you except your suspicion." Heron glanced at her from the corner of his eye. "Give me time, Clara Mae Dawson. I will either prove myself, or I will not. Either way, you and your family have a roof over your heads and food in your bellies tonight. That is more than you had this morning." It was. She could not argue with that simple truth. They rode on in silence. "Clara." The voice was quiet. It was Sam, crawling up from the wagon bed to squeeze himself in between her and Heron. "What is it?" "Is this man going to keep us?" Clara looked over at Heron. He looked back at her, waiting for her to answer. "I do not know yet," she said truthfully. "He has sad eyes," Sam observed. He studied Heron with the unsettling directness that children have. Like Papa did after the factory hurt him before he died. Heron's expression changed. Something flashed across his face, maybe pain or recognition. "Your Papa worked in a factory?" he asked Sam. Sam nodded. "He printed newspapers. The machine got him. It was loud, and there was blood, and Mama screamed and screamed, and—" "Sam," Clara pulled her brother close to her side. "You do not have to talk about it." "I want to." Sam's voice was small but firm. "Because if he knows about Papa, maybe he will understand why I am scared of loud noises, and why Clara gets angry when people grab us, and why Tommy cannot sleep without his blanket." Heron was quiet for a very long moment. "Sam," he said finally, "I am not going to pretend I understand everything you have been through. But I do know what it is like to lose family. I know what it is like to carry that loss around like a stone in your chest. And I know that sometimes the only thing that helps is finding new people to carry it with you." "Are you going to be one of those people?" Sam asked. "I am going to try." Sam considered this with the solemnity of an 8-year-old. Then he gave one single nod and crawled back to join the others. Clara watched him go. "He is braver than me," she murmured. "He is not," Heron said, keeping his eyes on the snowy road ahead. "He just has you to be brave for him. That is different." The first sign of the ranch finally appeared through the swirling snow. It was a massive wooden arch with the name Harland burned deep into the timber. "That is us," Heron said. "Welcome home." Home. The word caught in Clara's throat. What took shape out of the storm was bigger than anything she could have imagined. A three-story house built of timber and stone stood before them, its windows glowing against the gray afternoon. Smoke rose from two chimneys. Barns and stables seemed to stretch out forever into the white distance. "You own all of this?" she breathed. 12,000 acres. That is impossible. One man cannot own that much." "A man can own whatever he is strong enough to hold on to," Heron replied, guiding the horses toward the house. "My father started with 500 acres in a dream. I turned it into this." He paused. "And now I have got no one to leave it to." Before Clara could think of a response, the huge front door of the house burst open. A woman in her late 50s strode onto the porch, wrapped in a thick shawl, her face etched with worry. "Nathaniel Harlan, where have you been? The storm is getting worse by the minute, and Dan has been worried sick about the cattle, and—" She stopped dead. "Are those children?" "They are," Heron said as he jumped down from the wagon. "Mrs. Whitmore, meet Clara. Sam, Josie, Tommy, and Emmy. They are staying with us." "Staying with—" Mrs. Whitmore's mouth opened and then closed. "Nathaniel, you cannot just— This is not— There are procedures." "Procedures are done right now. They need warmth, food, and beds," Heron said, already lifting a sleeping Tommy from the wagon bed. "Everything else can wait until morning." Mrs. Whitmore looked at the children. She really looked at their thin faces and their threadbare clothes. She saw Tommy's clutched blanket and Josie's tear-stained cheeks, at Sam pressed against Clara's side, and at Emmy, who stood apart from everyone, watching it all with those ancient gray eyes. Something in the older woman's expression softened. "Well," she said briskly, "do not just stand there in the cold. Inside, all of you. I will put on some soup." The inside of the house hit Clara like a physical force. It was warmth, real warmth that seeped into bones that had forgotten what it felt like to not be cold. She stood in the entrance hall, dripping melted snow onto floors that probably cost more than her father had made in an entire year. And she just tried to breathe. "Do not touch anything," she hissed at Tommy, who was reaching out for a porcelain vase. "Everything can be touched." Heron had appeared beside them as silent as a ghost. "Everything can also be broken. Things get replaced. Children do not." Clara did not know how to respond to that. Mrs. Whitmore then swept through the room like a force of nature, gathering up the children and issuing orders. Hot baths, clean clothes, and soup into the kitchen. "Move, move, move!" The next 2 hours became a blur. The bathwater was so warm that it stung her skin. They were given night clothes that smelled like lavender instead of mold. They ate soup thick with vegetables and meat, served in a kitchen that was bigger than the entire dormitory Clara had shared with 11 other girls. Tommy fell asleep right there at the table, his face nearly in his bowl. Josie ate and ate and ate, as if she was afraid the food might suddenly vanish. Sam only pushed his soup around with his spoon, not tasting it. Emmy ate nothing at all. She just watched. And Clara, she watched Heron. He sat at the head of the long table, nursing a cup of coffee and saying very little. But his eyes were constantly moving, checking on each child, noticing who needed more food, who was struggling, who was scared. "You are staring," he said, without looking directly at her. "You are confusing," she replied. "How so?" "You bought 5 orphans, you brought us to your fancy ranch, and now you are just sitting there drinking coffee like it is a normal day. This is not normal." Heron finally met her gaze. "Nothing about today has been normal. But I figure we have all had enough drama for one day. Sometimes the best thing you can do is just be quiet. Let people breathe." Clara considered this. "I do not trust you," she said again. "I know. I am going to watch you every minute. If you do anything at all to hurt my family, I will make you regret it." Heron nodded slowly. "Fair enough. You are not afraid of a 10-year-old girl making threats. I am plain terrified." He did not smile, but a change flickered in his eyes. "Because I reckon you mean every word of it. And I suspect if I gave you a reason, you would find a way to follow through on that promise." "I would." "Then I suppose I had better not give you a reason." He finished the last of his coffee in one long swallow. "Mrs. Whitmore will get you settled in your rooms. Get some rest. We will sort out the rest of it come morning." He left the room without looking back. Clara just watched him leave. This quiet stranger had turned her life upside down with a bit of cash and a single word: family. She did not trust him one bit, but for the first time in 2 long years, she felt a pull to try. The bedroom was larger than any place Clara had ever laid her head. It held 2 beds, proper beds with thick mattresses and heavy quilts that smelled of cedar wood. There was a window looking out on the snow-blanketed prairie and a chest of drawers with a real mirror. Josie and Emmy were already snuggled up in one bed, huddled together even with all that room. Tommy was adamant about bunking with Sam in the room next door. Clara had already peeked in on them twice, finding both boys sound asleep. Tommy had his blanket in a death grip, and Sam's face looked peaceful for once. Now she was just standing by the window, watching the blizzard howl. "You cannot get to sleep either, can you?" Emmy's voice was a soft surprise in the quiet room. Clara turned around. The little girl was sitting straight up in bed, her dark hair falling around her delicate face. "How did you know? Your breathing changes when you're not asleep." Emmy hugged her knees close to her chest. "You are afraid?" "No, I am not." Clara cut herself off. There was no use in telling a lie. "Yes, I am." "Afraid of what?" "Of all of it. That this is all some kind of game. That he will have a change of heart. That we will open our eyes in the morning and be right back on that cold station platform." Emmy was silent for a good long while. "He is not going to send us back," she said at last. "And how can you be so sure?" "Because of the way he watches us. It is the same way my mama used to watch me." Emmy spoke like it was the simplest truth in the world. Like we are somebody special. Like we are worth something. Clara walked over to the bed and sat down on the very edge. "You can still remember your mama?" "Just bits and pieces sometimes." Emmy clutched the quilt a little tighter. "She had dark hair and gray eyes, same as me." "Same as him. Same as who?" "That man, Mr. Harlan." Emmy looked right into Clara's eyes. "He reminds me of a person I knew a long time ago. I just cannot place who." A shiver went right through Clara, and it was not from the winter air. "Emmy, that is, I am sure that is just a coincidence." "Maybe," Emmy said, but she did not sound like she believed it. "Clara." "Yes?" "I have a feeling we are meant to be right here. I have a feeling he was meant to find us." Clara had the urge to fight her on it, to tell her that the world was not that kind, that there was no fate, that they were just 5 unfortunate children who stumbled into a stroke of dumb luck. But when she looked at Emmy's gray eyes, which were so much like Harlan's now that she truly saw them, the words just would not come. "Just get some sleep," she said in place of all that. "Whatever is going to be, will be. For now, what we need is to rest." Emmy gave a little nod and laid her head back down, shutting her eyes. Clara went back to her spot by the window. From the floor below, she could hear quiet talking. It was Harlan and Mrs. Whitmore. "You have gone completely mad, Nathaniel." "I probably have. 5 children. 5 of them. What on earth are you planning to do with 5 children? I am going to raise them, assuming they will have me. You do not know the first thing about raising a child. Then it is something I will have to learn." There was a long stretch of silence. "This is all about Daniel, is it not?" Mrs. Whitmore's tone softened. "You believe you can set things right for what happened by taking in these strays?" "Perhaps I do." "Is there something so wrong with that?" "It is not wrong. It is just difficult. Those children are shattered, Nathaniel. They have been wounded in ways we cannot even begin to guess. You cannot patch that up with a checkbook and goodwill. I am not trying to patch them up. Harlan's voice got so quiet, Clara had to press her ear to the glass to make it out. I am just trying to give them the room they need to patch themselves up. And maybe, just maybe, while they are doing that, they can help me with the parts of me that are broken, too. The silence stretched on. You are a damn fool, Mrs. Whitmore said at last. But her words were wrapped in warmth now, in kindness. I have never said I was not. Clara pulled away from the window. Her eyes stung with heat, but no tears came. She had figured out a long time ago that crying was a waste of good effort. But a feeling was stirring inside her chest, something she could not put a name to. This man, this distant, quiet, and damaged man, had taken one look at 5 children nobody wanted and saw something worth the trouble. Not workers, not charity projects, not problems to be split up or cast aside. He had seen human beings. That did not mean she trusted him. Trust had to be earned, paid for in full. But for the first time in 2 long years, Clara Mae Dawson let herself picture a life that did not lead to another heartbreak. The thought was horrifying. It was also, she understood as she finally got into her own bed, the first move toward a place that could one day be called home. The first sign of trouble showed up 3 days later. Clara had been expecting it. Anything good in her life never lasted long. She knew that better than anybody. So when the screaming began at 2 o'clock in the morning, a part of her was almost grateful. At last, the good luck was running out. She was on her feet before she was even fully awake, running down the hallway to the boys' room. Tommy's cries bounced off the walls, raw and full of terror, the sort of screaming that comes from a place far worse than any bad dream. Fire! Fire! Mama, the fire is here. Clara threw the door open. Tommy was fighting his blankets, thrashing around with his eyes wide open, but not seeing a thing. Sam was huddled in the far corner, his hands clamped over his ears, just rocking himself back and forth. Tommy. Clara took hold of his shoulders. Tommy, you need to wake up. There is not any fire. You are safe now. It is burning. It is all burning up. I can smell the smoke. I can smell it. There is no fire. She gathered him up into her arms and held on to him with all her might. Shush now, shush. I have got you. You are here at the ranch. Do you remember Mr. Harlan's ranch? We are all safe here. Heavy footsteps pounded down the hall. Harlan showed up in the doorway, his hair a mess, and his shirt only halfway buttoned. Mrs. Whitmore stood behind him holding a candle, her face looking white in the flickering light. What is going on? Harlan's voice was gravelly from being woken up. A night terror. Clara did not even raise her head. He has them every now and then. It is about the fire that took his family. Tommy was still crying, but at least the awful screaming was over. His little body was trembling against Clara's. I want my mama, he whimpered. I want to go back home. I know, sweet boy, I know. Harlan came into the room, taking his time, moving with care. He knelt down next to Clara and Tommy, not too close, but near enough to be of help. Hey there, little man. His voice was softer than Clara had ever imagined it could be. A hard night, is it? Tommy took a little peek from the safety of Clara's arms. His face was a mess of tears and snot, his eyes all red and puffy. I saw the fire, he whispered. It was swallowing everything up. I know that fires can be frightening. Harlan started to reach out a hand, paused for a second, and then rested it softly on Tommy's shoulder. But do you know the one thing that is good about fires? Tommy just shook his head no. They burn out. Every single fire. Does not matter how big and mean it is, it always burns itself out. And after that you start to rebuild. That is what folks do. We build again. But my mama did not rebuild. She just left. Clara felt a sharp pain in her chest, like her heart had split right down the middle. Harlan did not say anything for a long time. When he finally found his voice, it was heavy with emotion. You are right about that. Some people just cannot rebuild, and that is the most difficult thing in this whole world to wrap your head around. He edged a little closer, slow enough that Tommy could shrink back if he felt like it. "But can you guess what your mama would want for you?" "What?" "She would want you to do the rebuilding for her. She would want you to get big and strong and be happy and have a good life. That is the only thing a mama ever wants for her child." Tommy's lower lip started to shake. "How do you know that?" "Because that is exactly what my own mama wanted for me. And for my brother Daniel, the one we lost in the snow, she wanted it for him too." Harlan's voice hitched just a little. "She told me after he passed that the best way to remember him was to live a good life, to not let the fire or the snow or anything else win." Tommy thought about this with the serious focus that only a 5-year-old trying to understand the impossible can have. "So, if I am happy," he said, real slow, "that means Mama wins." "That is exactly right. Mama wins." A change came over Tommy's face. It was not happiness. He was too little, and had been through too much for that, but it was something close to understanding. "Okay," he whispered. "I will try." "Is that not all anyone can ever ask?" Harlan got to his feet, his knees popping. "Do you think you can get back to sleep now?" Tommy looked over at Clara and then at Sam, who was still balled up in the corner. "Can we all sleep in the big bed together?" Clara shot a look at Harlan. He gave one firm nod. "I will get Mrs. Whitmore to fetch some extra blankets," he said. "You children can use my room. The bed is bigger." "We cannot take your room," Clara protested. "You are not taking it. It is being given." Harlan was already on his way out the door. "I have got records to get caught up on regardless. I was not getting much sleep anyway." He was gone before Clara had a chance to say another word. Mrs. Whitmore came in with her arms piled high with quilts, and the look on her face was gentle in a way Clara had never seen. "All right, children. Let us get you all tucked in." The whole group of them marched down the hall to Harlan's room, all 5 of them, as Josie and Emmy had shown up at some point, woken by all the noise. The bed was enormous, more than enough space to fit every one of them. Tommy curled into a ball right in the center, holding on to his blanket. Sam snuggled up right behind Clara. Josie made herself into a protective cocoon around Tommy, and Emmy laid on the far edge, just staring up at the ceiling with those serious gray eyes. "Clara." Josie's voice was hard to hear through the bedding. "Yes. Is this how it feels to have a father?" Clara had no idea how to answer a question like that. Their own father had been kind but far away, always on the move, always bone-tired. He loved them, she was sure of it. But he was not the type to kneel down in the dark of night to talk about dying fires and a mother's strength. "I am not sure," she answered truthfully. "Possibly. I believe I like it. Do not get too comfortable with it." But as the words left her mouth, Clara knew they were empty. Something had changed tonight. It was something she could not put a name to and did not want to look at too hard. She shut her eyes, and, for the first time in a long, long time, she slept without being afraid. The morning arrived gray and chilly. Clara woke up and saw Tommy still curled up next to her with his thumb in his mouth, a habit he had stopped months before. The others were still asleep, their breathing soft and steady. She quietly got out of bed, careful not to disturb them, and tiptoed downstairs in the nightgown she had been given. Harlan was in the kitchen, standing over the stove. The smell of bacon and coffee hung in the air. "You can cook." Clara could not keep the surprise out of her voice. "When I need to." He did not turn to face her. "Mrs. Whitmore does not get here until 8. I have been making my own breakfast for 15 years. Clara waited in the doorway, unsure of what to do. This moment felt different than the emergency last night. It felt more personal somehow, more risky. "Thank you," she finally said, "for what you did for Tommy." "I did not do anything special. You did." Clara had to force herself to speak. "No one has ever spoken to him that way, as if his feelings were important, as if his mother was important." Harlan stood quietly for a good while. Then he turned around, spatula in hand, and looked right at her. Every person's feelings are important, Clara. Even the little ones. Especially the little ones. He went back to the stove. Are you hungry? I can eat. Then have a seat. The bacon is just about done. Clara sat at the large wooden table and watched him move. He worked with an easy, practiced skill, like a man who was used to being by himself. Can I ask you a question? She said. You do that quite a bit. Is that a bother? No, just something I have noticed. He slid bacon from the pan onto a plate, and then cracked eggs into the hot grease. Ask. Last night, when you mentioned your mother wanting you to live a good life, did she truly say that? Harlan's hands stopped moving for a heartbeat. Then he started cooking again. She did, right before she passed. The consumption got her about 3 years after Daniel. His voice was plain, but Clara could hear the hurt buried deep inside it. She held my hand and said I had spent too much time mourning my brother, that Daniel would want me to find happiness, that she wanted me to find happiness. Were you happy? No. He put the eggs on plates, brought both servings to the table, and sat down opposite her. Not for a very long time. I built this entire ranch because I did not know what else to do with myself. I buried myself in work, because that was easier than dealing with my feelings. I kept everyone at arm's length because losing people just hurt too much. What made things change? Nothing. Harlan lifted his fork. Nothing at all changed. I just got weary of being so miserable. And then you 5 appeared, and I thought... His voice faded. You thought what? I thought that maybe it was not too late to try over again, to have something worth living for beyond cattle and the bottom line. Clara took this in. It was more than she had anticipated. More truthful, more open. That is a heavy load to place on 5 orphans, she said cautiously. You are right. It is. Harlan looked her straight in the eye. And I am sorry about that. You did not ask to be anyone's reason for living. You just needed a roof over your heads. We need more than that. The words came out before she could stop them. I know. Harlan put his fork down. You need someone who will be there every single day, not just when it is easy or when things go wrong. Someone who will take the time to learn your names and what scares you and what you dream about. Someone who is going to make mistakes and say he is sorry and then try again. Can you be that man? I do not know. His honesty was sharp. I have never been that person for anybody, but I am willing to try. That is the only promise I can make. Clara picked up her own fork and took a bite of eggs. They were delicious, better than anything she had eaten at the orphanage. All right, she said. All right. I will give you a chance. It was not trust, not yet, but it was a beginning. She aimed her fork at him. But if you cause any of them pain, I will make you regret it. You have said that before. I meant it then, and I mean it now. Something that might have been a smile touched Harlan's face for a second. Understood. They finished their meal in silence after that. But it was a different kind of quiet, more comfortable, less on edge. The other children came downstairs one after another. Josie was first, then Sam leading Tommy, who was still half asleep. Emmy came last, as she always did, taking everything in with those serious gray eyes. Harlan cooked more eggs and more bacon. Mrs. Whitmore showed up and immediately took charge, fussing about balanced meals and how growing children needed to eat their vegetables. It was, Clara realized with a jolt, almost like being in a family. The idea was frightening, but not as much as it had been the day before. After breakfast, Harlan said he had work to do. The ranch did not run on its own, he explained, and the storm had put them 3 days behind schedule. But he would be back for supper, and tomorrow he would start to properly show them the place. Clara watched him leave, then turned to see Mrs. Whitmore looking at her. What? Nothing, dear. The older woman had a thoughtful look on her face. I am just seeing something I did not expect to see. And what is that? Hope. Mrs. Whitmore passed her a dish towel. Now make yourself useful. Those dishes are not going to dry themselves. The day flew by in a flurry of chores. Mrs. Whitmore found jobs for all of them. They were small tasks suited to their ages, and none of them felt like a punishment. Tommy helped her sort a jar of buttons. Josie was taught how to fold napkins properly. Sam took on the pantry, counting cans with the focus of a boy who understood that knowing exactly how much food you had could be the difference between a full belly and an empty one. Emmy vanished. Clara noticed she was gone around noon, and her heart clenched with fear. "Where is Emmy?" She clutched Sam's arm. "When was the last time you saw her?" "I'm not sure. At breakfast, I think." Clara was already moving toward the door when Mrs. Whitmore stopped her. "She is in the barn." "What?" "I saw her sneak out an hour or so ago. She has been sitting with the horses." A wave of relief washed over Clara, but it was quickly replaced by anger. She cannot just wander off like that. She could get lost or get hurt or... She is fine. Whitmore's voice was steady. "Just let her be." "But..." "Clara," the older woman put a hand on her shoulder. "That little girl has not been at ease for 1 second since she arrived. She watches every person. She knows where every exit is. She sleeps with one eye open. Does that sound like anyone you know?" Clara could feel her cheeks grow warm. If being with the horses helps her feel safe, then let her be with the horses. She will return when she is ready. Clara wanted to protest, to run out to that barn and pull Emmy back inside where she could watch her and keep her safe. But she knew Mrs. Whitmore was right. Emmy needed some room to breathe. They all did. "Fine," Clara said, her jaw tight. "But if she's not back for supper, you can be the one to go get her. Deal." "Agreed." Emmy returned on her own about an hour before the sun went down. She came in through the kitchen door as quiet as a ghost, her dark hair full of hay and her gray eyes shining brighter than Clara had ever seen them. "Where have you been?" Clara asked sharply. "The barn. There is a horse, a gray one. She let me pet her. You cannot just disappear like that. I was worried sick." "I know." Emmy did not say she was sorry, but she did say, "I needed to think." "Think about what?" Emmy was silent for a long while. Finally, she spoke. "About how this feels wrong." A chill went down Clara's spine. "Wrong? In what way?" "Not wrong like it is bad. Just..." Emmy searched for the right words. "It feels too right. Too simple. Things do not just get better all of a sudden, not for children like us, not for children." Clara sat down heavily, pulling Emmy into the chair next to her. "I know just what you mean." "You do?" "Yes. I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to decide he made a mistake, for this all to just vanish. What if it does not?" The question just hung there in the air between them. "Then I suppose we will have to learn how to live with good things happening," Clara said at last, "even if it feels impossible." Emmy thought about that. That sounds difficult. It is harder than the bad stuff sometimes. They sat quietly until Mrs. Whitmore called them in for supper. Harlan came in covered with snow and smelling of the herd. He kicked his boots clean on the porch, shook the white powder from his coat, and walked into the kitchen looking worn out, but pleased. "The storm is breaking up," he said to everyone. "Tomorrow we can start moving the cattle to their winter grazing lands." "We?" Clara asked. "You want to learn how to be a ranch hand? I want to learn everything." The words burst out of her stronger than she had meant them to be. "I am not going to be a freeloader. None of us are." Harlan studied her for a long moment. Then he gave a slow nod. "All right, then. Tomorrow, you ride with me. I will teach you the fundamentals. What about the others?" "Sam can give Dan a hand in the stables. He is my foreman. You will meet him tomorrow. Josie and Tommy can help Mrs. Whitmore around the house. And Emmy." He paused, looking over at the dark-haired girl who was watching him with those sharp gray eyes. "Emmy can do whatever she pleases. The barn, the house, wherever she feels the most comfortable. You are not going to put her to work." Clara was suspicious. "I'm not going to put any of you to work. This is not some orphanage. You are not here to earn your bed and board." Harlan sat himself down at the head of the table. "But if you have a mind to learn, I will teach you. If you want to help out, I will let you help out. The decision is yours." It was, Clara realized, the first time in years that anybody had offered her a choice. Dinner was much quieter than their first arrival. Everyone was tired. It was the kind of deep exhaustion in your bones that comes from too much emotion packed into too few days. Tommy fell asleep before he even finished his soup. Sam's eyes kept drooping shut. Even Josie's usual chatter had faded away to just a few murmurs. Heron carried Tommy up to bed without anyone needing to ask. Clara followed with the other children, tucking them in one by one, checking the windows and the doors out of pure habit. When she finally came back downstairs, she found Heron in the parlor, just staring at a portrait that hung above the fireplace. It showed a man and a woman, stern-faced and posed formally. His parents, she guessed. "They look serious," she said to let him know she was there. "They were serious people," Heron said without turning around. "They built this ranch from nothing. They survived droughts, blizzards, and raids. They lost 2 sons, Daniel to the cold, and my older brother Robert to cholera when he was only 3. You had another brother. I barely remember him. I was just a baby when he died." Heron finally turned to face her. "My mother used to say that losing children was the price of living in the West, that you had to just keep going, keep building, because stopping for any reason meant dying." "That is harsh." It was honest. This land does not care about your feelings. It will kill you just as soon as look at you. He gestured toward the portrait. "They survived by being hard, by keeping their hearts from getting tangled up in anything that could be snatched away. Is that the lesson you took from them?" "It is what I lived by for 25 years. Harlan's voice went quiet. "And it is what I am trying my best to forget now." Clara scooted nearer to the fire, warming her palms. "Why is that?" "Because all that hardness kept my heart beating, but it never let me rightly live." He sank down into one of the armchairs. "I have got more money than a man could ever spend, more land than I can ride across in a day. And up until a week ago, I did not have a single soul to share it with. You had Mrs. Whitmore and Dan. They are employees, maybe friends, but they are not kin." Harlan looked straight at her. "You asked me one time why I really brought you children here. The honest truth is I do not rightly know. But a piece of it, a big piece, was seeing you on that stage, fighting for your brother and sisters, refusing to let anybody split you apart. And I thought to myself, that is what I should have done for Daniel. That is the man I should have been. You cannot carry the blame for what happened to your brother. You were only 15, old enough to have known better, old enough to have saved him, and old enough to make a mistake." Clara sat in the chair across from him. "Believe me, I know a thing or two about blaming yourself for things you had no power over. My papa died because his factory had busted machines they never bothered to fix. My mama passed on because we could not pay for a doctor. None of that was on me, but I surely spent a long time thinking it was. What made you change your mind?" "Nothing changed. I just got plain tired of carrying that weight." She gave a small smile. "Does that sound familiar?" A flicker of something crossed Harlan's face. "Using my own words against me. Well, if they are good words, why should they not be used?" He almost let out a laugh. "Almost. You are a real piece of work, Clara Mae Dawson. So I have been told." They sat there in a comfortable quiet, with the fire popping and crackling between them. "Can I ask you a question?" Clara finally said. "You are going to ask it whether I say yes or no." "Probably." She paused for a second. "Emmy said something odd today, about you looking like a man she knew a long time ago. And last night she said, 'You look at us the same way her mama used to look at her.'" Harlan's face stayed like stone. But something changed deep in his eyes. And I cannot stop thinking about how she will not tell a soul where she came from, how she just showed up at that orphanage one day. No papers, no family history, nothing at all. Clara leaned in closer. "Her eyes are gray, just like yours. Her hair is dark, just like yours, and there is just something about the set of her face. Clara, I am not pointing a finger at you. I just need to know if there is something you are not telling us." Harlan was silent for a long, heavy moment. "My brother Daniel," he started talking slow. "He had a sweetheart right before he died. A young woman from the Shoshone tribe. Her family used to camp for the winter near our land." A drum started beating hard in Clara's chest. "He never did tell our folks about her. They would not have approved, but I knew. I saw the two of them together one time down by the creek." Harlan's voice sounded far away, lost in the memory. "After Daniel passed, her family moved on. I never laid eyes on her again, never had any idea what became of her. You think Emmy could be? I do not know." He cut her off sharp. "I do not know, and I cannot know. And I am not about to get that little girl's hopes all wound up over a gut feeling and a pair of gray eyes. But if she is your family, she is already family." Harlan's voice was solid as an oak tree. "All 5 of you are. It does not matter one bit whose blood is running in whose veins. I chose you. You are mine now. That is all that matters." Clara wanted to press him, wanted to demand he tell her more, but she saw something in his face. Maybe it was fear, or a hope too delicate to look at straight on, so she held her tongue. "All right," she said, her voice soft. "But one day, if Emmy wants to know where she comes from, we will find out. Together, I give you my word." He stood up all of a sudden, looking every bit of his 40-some-odd years. "But for tonight, you need your rest. We have a long day ahead of us tomorrow." Clara stood up too. At the door, she stopped. "Mr. Harlan." "Call me Nate." Mr. Harlan was my father. Nate. The name felt new on her tongue. "Thank you for all of it. For Tommy last night, and for giving Emmy her space, for trying." He gave a single nod. That small gesture she was starting to understand was his way of saying, "You are welcome." Clara climbed the stairs, her thoughts swirling with questions that had no answers. Emmy's hidden past, Nate's lost brother. The chance that this family they were putting together might be tied by more than just luck. But those were worries for another day. For tonight, her brother and sisters were safe. They were warm, and they had full bellies. For right now, that was more than enough. In her room, she saw Josie was already fast asleep, hugged around a pillow like she thought it might get away. Emmy was lying on the other side of the bed, her eyes wide open, watching Clara in the dim light. "You talked to him," Emmy whispered. "About me? How did you know?" "I heard you. Sound travels in these old houses." Clara slipped into the bed, finding her spot between her sisters. "Are you mad at me?" "No." Emmy was quiet for a bit. "Do you think it is true that I might be related to his brother?" "I do not know. Does it make a difference?" Emmy thought about this with the heavy seriousness of a child made to grow up too soon. "I just want to belong somewhere. To someone. I am so tired of being a nobody from nowhere. You are not a nobody." Clara reached over and found Emmy's hand in the dark. "You are my sister. Maybe not from the same blood, but by choice. That is what Nate said. We are family because we chose to be. Is that enough?" "It has to be." Clara squeezed her hand tight. "Because right now, it is everything we have." Emmy was quiet for so long, Clara figured she had drifted off to sleep. Then, just barely a whisper. "I think I am starting to like him, Nate. I think he is a good man. I think so, too. Does that scare you?" "It terrifies me." "Good." Emmy's voice had a little something in it that sounded like a smile. I thought I was the only one. They laid there together in the dark. 3 girls who had made it through the worst things imaginable, holding on to each other in a world that had done its best to break them apart. Tomorrow would surely bring new troubles, new worries, new chances to trust somebody or be let down. But tonight, They were safe. And for the first time in longer than any of them could recall, that safety did not feel like it was a lie. The trouble rolled in on a Sunday, wrapped in a black coat and a whole heap of righteous anger. Clara spotted the wagon coming from the kitchen window where she was helping Mrs. Whitmore knead bread dough. 2 weeks had gone by since the auction. 2 weeks of learning how a ranch works, of falling into a daily rhythm, of slowly, so slowly, starting to think that maybe this good thing could last. She should have known it was too good to be true. "Someone is coming," she said, her hands stopping in the dough. Mrs. Whitmore looked up, squinted her eyes to see through the frosted window pane, and all the color drained from her face. "Get the children upstairs." "Why, who is that?" "Just do as I say now." Clara did not waste time arguing. She knew how to hear danger in a grown-up's voice, and Mrs. Whitmore's was screaming it. She wiped her hands on her apron and took off running. Sam and Tommy were in the parlor playing with some wooden blocks Nate had carved for them. Josie was sitting by the fire reading. She had found Nate's library and had hardly left it since. Emmy, like she often was nowhere to be found. "Upstairs," Clara commanded. "All of you, right now." "Why?" Josie looked up from the pages of her book. "What is wrong?" "I do not know yet. Just go." Sam took Tommy's hand without a word. They had done this dance before, running from trouble, hiding from danger. That instinct was carved right into their bones. Josie did not move. "Clara, go." So they went. Clara spun back toward the kitchen just as the front door flew open with a bang. Reverend Jonas Cutter was standing in the main hall with snow swirling around him like he was wearing a cloak of it. Behind him stood 2 men Clara had never seen before. Big men with hard faces and the look of hired trouble. "Where is Nathaniel Harlan?" Cutter's voice was as smooth as creek water flowing over sharp rocks. "He is not here." Clara stood her ground in the hallway, making herself a barrier to the stairs. "He is out with the cattle. He will not be back till sundown." "Perfect." Cutter's smile made her skin crawl right off her bones. "Then we will just take the children and be on our way before he gets back." Clara's blood ran cold as ice. "You cannot do that." "Oh, I can. And I will." Cutter reached inside his coat and pulled out a folded-up paper. "This here is a court order signed by Judge Whitfield down in Helena. It says Nathaniel Harlan's guardianship is null and void, and it puts all 5 of you children in my care until we have a formal hearing. You are a liar. I assure you, ma'am, I am not." Cutter took a step closer, his eyes like chips of ice. "Mr. Harlan might have bought you with his money, but he cannot buy respectability. A single man, living all alone with no wife and not a lick of experience raising children. The territorial court doesn't look kindly on setups like that. He has been good to us." Clara's voice trembled, but she stood her ground. "Better than anyone has ever been. I am sure he has. But being good is not the point. What is proper is the point. What is legal is the point." Cutter slipped the paper back inside his coat. "Now you go on and gather up your brother and sisters and come along quietly. I would surely hate for this to turn sour. I am not going anywhere with you." The first man was on her in a flash, rough and brutal, yanking Clara's arm and twisting it hard behind her back. A sharp pain shot up her shoulder, but she refused to cry out. She would not give them that satisfaction. "Let her go." Emmy's voice, as sharp and cold as a winter wind, sliced through the hall. Clara craned her head and saw Emmy standing at the top of the stairs, with Sam and Tommy right behind her. Josie was clutching the railing so hard her knuckles were white. In her hand, Emmy held a kitchen knife. "Well now," Cutter's smile stretched wider. "The quiet one finally speaks, and with such a flair for the dramatic." "Let my sister go," Emmy said again, "or I will cut you. You are a 6-year-old child. Put that knife down before you hurt yourself." Emmy started down the stairs, slow and steady, the knife held firm in her little hand. Her gray eyes were locked on Cutter's face. "I have hurt people before," she said, her voice low. when they tried to make me go places I did not want to go. The man at the orphanage, the one who liked to sneak into the girls' dormitory at night, he is missing a few of his fingers now. Clara felt the grip on her arm go a little slack. The man holding her was now staring at Emmy with a look of real worry. "You are bluffing," Cutter said, but his voice was not nearly as sure of itself. "Try me." The silence in the hall was so thick you could hardly breathe. Clara's mind was racing. Where was Nate? Where was Dan? Where was anybody who could put a stop to this? The front door swung open again. What in the Sam Hill is going on in here? The voice belonged to a woman, and it was sharp and commanding. Clara twisted to see a tall, auburn-haired woman in the doorway, dressed in practical wool clothes with a rifle resting on her shoulder. "Mrs. Mercer." Cutter's voice went cold. "This is none of your concern. A man breaking into my neighbor's house with a couple of hired thugs? I reckon it concerns me plenty." The woman, Kate Mercer, Clara remembered Nate talking about her, stepped right inside, her hand resting near the trigger of her rifle. "Let the girl go, now. I have a court order. I do not care. If you have a handwritten letter from God himself, you do not come dragging children out of their home in the middle of a blizzard." Kate's eyes were pure ice. "Let her go." The man dropped Clara's arm. She stumbled a bit, catching her balance, and then immediately planted herself between Cutter and the stairs. "This is not over," Cutter said, his voice wound tight with the rage he could barely hold back. "The law is on my side. Those children belong in a proper Christian home, not with some godless bachelor who thinks he can buy anything he pleases. Then you take it up with the courts the right way, through the proper channels, not with strong-arm tactics and ambushes." Kate lifted her rifle just a little. "Now you get out of this house before I decide you are trespassing and act on it." Cutter stared her down for a long, venomous moment. Then he spun around and stormed out, his men right behind him. The door slammed shut. Kate lowered her rifle and let out a long sigh. "Is everybody all right?" Clara's legs turned to jelly. She sank right down on the floor, shaking so hard her teeth were chattering. "Clara." Emmy was right there beside her in a second, the knife forgotten on the floor, her small hands gripping Clara's shoulders. "Clara, you have to breathe. They are gone. Just breathe." "I am okay." But Clara was not okay. She was scared to death and furious and sick to her stomach, knowing how close they had come. "I am all right." Kate knelt down next to them, her face softening. "You must be Clara. Nate has told me all about you." "He has?" "Said you are the bravest person he has ever known." Kate helped her get back on her feet. "I'm starting to understand why." The other children had snuck down the stairs. Tommy was crying quietly. Sam was white as a ghost. Josie was holding her book like it was a shield. "What is going to happen?" Josie asked, her voice just a tiny thing. "Are they going to come take us away?" "Not if I have anything to say about it." Kate's jaw was set firm. "We need to get word to Nate. Then we will decide what to do next." Nate came home like a blue norther made of pure fury. Clara heard the horse long before she saw it, its hooves thundering against the frozen earth, coming at a dead run. Then the front door busted open and Nate was standing there, his eyes wild, breathing hard. "Where are they?" His voice did not sound human. "I will kill them. I will kill them all." "They are gone." Kate stepped in front of him, her hands up. "Nate, Nate, you look at me. The children are safe. Everyone is all right." His gaze found Clara, found the bruise that was already starting to bloom on her arm. "He put his hands on my daughter. My daughter." The words hit Clara like a punch to the gut. "I am fine," she was able to say. Emmy ran them off with a knife. Nate looked over at Emmy, and something passed over his face. Maybe it was pride, or maybe fear. "Show me the court order," he said, his voice still pulled tight with a rage he could barely hold back. He took it with him, but he said, "The papers were from Judge Whitfield over in Helena." "Whitfield?" The muscle in Nate's jaw went tight. "That snake oil peddling charlatan Cutter must have paid him off." Can they really do that? Sam asked. Can a judge just come and take us away like that? Nate dropped to one knee, getting right down on Sam's level. Now y'all listen to me, every one of you. He held on until 5 sets of worried eyes were locked on his. Ain't nobody taking y'all from this place. I don't give a damn what kind of papers they're waving or which judges they've got in their pockets. Y'all are my kin. I'll fight for y'all with every last breath in me. But what happens if you lose? Tommy's voice was so quiet it was almost lost. Nate's hard look softened. Then I'll just keep on fighting. And when I can't fight no more, I'll find another way to fight. I am not giving up on y'all. Not now, not ever. Do you understand me? Tommy just nodded, big tears rolling down his cheeks. Good. Nate got to his feet and faced Kate. I've got to get to Helena. Find a judge who's on the level. Get this whole mess tossed out. The mountain passes are near shut with this weather. I don't care, Nate shot back. Kate grabbed his arm. If you ride out now, you're leaving these children with no protection. Cutter could show up again with more men, fancier papers, who knows what else. So what do you suggest I do? Send Dan to Helena. He knows that country better than anybody. You need to stay put, guard your family, and we'll start getting folks in town on our side. The town? Nate let out a bitter laugh. The same town that's been calling me a fool for taking in 5 orphans. The shit town that looks the other way when we come near. Not all of them. Kate's voice was steady. There are decent folks in this town, Nate. People who know what it feels like to be in need and be ignored. Just let me go talk to them. Clara took in the whole scene, her thoughts spinning. Kate Mercer talked to Nate like he was no different than her. She stood up to him without a lick of fear, and the way he looked back at her. All right, Nate said, raking a hand through his hair. Dan will head for Helena in the morning. You can work on the town, and I will. You will stay right here with your children, Kate finished for him, which is where you ought to be. After Kate was gone, Nate called them all into the living room. A fire was going in the fireplace, making long shadows dance across the walls. Mrs. Whitmore brought in hot chocolate, a treat so rich Clara had never even imagined it before she came to this place. They all sat there in a circle looking for all the world like a little war council made up of kids and one worn-out rancher. I need you all to tell me precisely what went on, Nate said. Every last detail. Don't you leave a single thing out. And so Clara told him. She told him about Cutter showing up, his sharp words, the official paper, and the man who grabbed her arm. She laid it all out plain. No tears, like a soldier giving a report from the front lines. When she got to the part about Emmy and the knife, Nate looked over at the littlest girl. Emmy, that story you told about the man at the orphanage, was that true? Emmy gave a single small nod. Why didn't you say anything to anybody? Who was I gonna tell? Emmy's voice was barely a whisper. Nobody ever believes orphans. We were just things, to be handled however anyone wanted. The quiet that came after was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I'm so sorry, Nate's voice hitched. I am sorry that was your life for all of you. You all deserved a whole lot better. It is not your fault, Clara said. No, but I can sure as heck make certain it will not happen again. His eyes went from one child to the next. From this moment on, nobody sets foot outside by themselves. We stick together like glue. We watch each other's backs. If that man Cutter or anyone else shows up on this land again, you run, you hide, you make a racket, you do whatever is necessary to stay safe until I can get to you. What if you do not get here? Sam asked. Help will always get here. Nate's voice was pure iron. Because I will always come for you, no matter what happens. Do you believe me? Sam's eyes flickered to Clara. Clara's gaze met Emmy's. Emmy glanced at Josie. Josie looked at Tommy. A look passed between them, the kind that does not need words, a language known only to children who had been through the fire together. We believe you, Clara said at last. But we are not running anymore. We are through with being scared. If they are coming for us, they're going to have a fight on their hands. All of us. Nate just looked at her for a good long while. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. All right, then. We will fight them together. The days that followed were a whirlwind of getting ready. Dan took off for Helena the very next morning, his saddlebags filled with letters from Nate for every judge, lawyer, and public servant who might have an ear to lend. Kate Mercer, true to her word, started knocking on doors all over town telling every soul who would listen what Reverend Cutter had tried to do. The way the town responded, well, it caught them all by surprise. It began with little things. A fresh-baked pie sitting on the porch with no name on it. A stack of warm clothes just showing up by the gate. Before long, people started to come by themselves. Ranchers, the man from the general store. Even the schoolteacher Clara was sure despised them. I heard about what took place, Miss Patterson said, standing there a bit uncomfortably in the Harlan front room, holding a basket full of books. I wanted to make sure you knew that not everyone in this town sees eye to eye with Reverend Cutter. Well, you could have fooled me, Clara mumbled under her breath. Clara, Nate said in a low voice. No, the girl is right. Miss Patterson's face turned pink. We have not been good neighbors. We have whispered and passed judgment, and made up our minds about you based on nothing but our own narrow views. She placed the basket on a small table. I am truly sorry. These are for the children, to help them with their schoolwork. The minute she walked out the door, Josie was on those books like they were treasure. Sam looked them over more carefully while Tommy lost interest right away. But Emmy, she picked up a book. It was called Frontier History, and she started to read like the world around her had disappeared. Why are they all being so kind to us now? Josie asked, her eyes still glued to a book of fairy tales. Because they are finally seeing Cutter for who he truly is, Nate answered. Who is he really? He is a man who is more interested in control than he is in folks. Nate sat down, and the chair sighed under his weight. He has been trying, to get this town under his thumb for years. Putting orphans in homes is just one way he does it. The church gives him money for every child he places. The harder the place he puts them, the more folks get desperate, and the more they put in the collection plate. So we were just money in his pocket. You were. Not anymore. Clara saw the deep weariness etched on Nate's face. He had barely gotten any sleep since the incident, walking the property line all night, checking every lock and window, jumping at every little noise. You ought to get some rest, she told him. I will rest once I know y'all are safe. We are never going to be perfectly safe. That is not how this world is built. Nate looked at her, and something in his gaze softened. Where did you get to be so smart? I guess when life quit giving me any other way to be. He had no reply for that. The date for the court hearing arrived sooner than any of them figured. Dan came back from Helena bearing news. A man named Judge Crane, a circuit judge with a reputation for being fair, had taken the case. The first order from Judge Whitfield, the one Cutter had, was put on hold until things could be looked at again. They had 2 weeks. 14 days to get ready, to find proof, to find people who would speak for them. 14 days to prove that 5 hurt little kids belonged with one busted-up rancher more than they belonged to a crooked preacher. That is not near enough time, Nate said, wearing a path in the parlor floor. Kate had come by to help them map out a plan. Cutter has had months to get his story straight. He has money, powerful friends, and the whole church backing him. And what have you got, Kate asked him. 5 children and a ranch. You have got a lot more than that. Kate put a hand on his arm, making him stop his pacing. You have got the truth on your side. You have got people who have witnessed what you have done for these children, and you have got me. A quiet understanding flowed between them. Clara, peeking from the hallway, felt like she was interrupting something private. I cannot ask you to do this. You are not asking. I am offering, Kate said, her voice full of resolve. I have seen you change, Nate. You went from being the most solitary man in all of Wyoming to a man with a reason to get up in the morning. These children did that for you. You did that for yourself. I am not about to stand by and watch some greedy preacher tear it all down." Nate did not say anything for a long moment. Then he reached out and took Kate's hand, holding it in his. "Thank you." Clara backed away before either of them saw her. She had her own things to see to. She found Emmy out in the barn, sitting quietly with the gray horse that had become her safe place. "I need to talk with you," Clara said. Emmy kept her eyes on the horse. "About the hearing. About what you said back when Cutter was here. About that man back at the orphanage." Emmy's hands went still on the horse's coat. "They're going to ask us about our past," Clara said softly. "About everything that happened before. If you have to take the stand, I will tell them everything. Are you certain? It is going to be hard. They are going to make you talk about it in a room full of people you do not know. They might not believe you." Emmy finally raised her head. Her gray eyes looked ancient, much older than what you would expect in a 6-year-old girl's face. "Clara, nobody has ever believed me my whole life. Having it happen one more time is not going to be what breaks me." She paused for a second. "Will you be up there with me when I tell them? I will be right there next to you the entire time." Emmy gave one firm nod, then turned back to brushing the horse. Clara left her there with her thoughts. The night before they were due in court, Clara could not find any sleep. She tiptoed down the stairs, thinking the house would be dark and still. But there was Nate sitting at the kitchen table. A single candle was burning, its light falling on a stack of papers spread out before him. "You ought to be asleep," she said. "So should you." She pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "What are all those papers?" "Letters from folks in town." Kate went and got them. He slid a few of them over to her. "Go on, read them." "Go." Clara read the first letter and then the next and the one after that. They were all stories. Stories about Nate, about how he had lent a hand to a farmer whose barn burned down, how he had given his ranch hands extra wages when times were tough, how he had quietly settled the doctor's bill for families that were struggling. "I had no idea you did any of these things," Clara said. "I never did it for folks to see. It just felt like the right thing to do. These could really help us. Maybe." Nate squared up the pile of letters, "But it is not really about me. It is about you kids. It is about whether this is the best place for you or not. We are better off right here. The judge might not look at it that way. Single man knows nothing about raising kids, no wife, no proper family to speak of. Family is not about all that." Clara's voice was full of fire. "Family is about who is there for you, who sticks around, who will go to bat for you when things get rough." Nate just looked at her for a long time. "When did you start believing in that?" Clara thought on his question. When did she stop looking over her shoulder, just waiting for the other shoe to drop? When did she finally start to trust this quiet, sad man who had taken in 5 orphans and was trying so hard to figure out how to be a father? "I could not tell you for sure," she finally said. "It happened somewhere in between listening to Tommy's bad dreams and seeing Emmy with that knife and hearing you call me your daughter like it was the most normal thing on God's green earth. I meant every word. I know you did." Clara reached her hand across the table and placed it over his. "And that is the reason we are going to win this thing tomorrow. Because you mean it. Because you picked us when you did not have to. Because, for the first time in my whole life, I actually believe someone who tells me they are not going to give up on me." Nate's eyes shone in the candlelight. "Clara Mae Dawson," he said in a low voice. "You are the toughest soul I have ever had the privilege to know. I had to be. But maybe." She stopped, trying to find the right words. "Maybe now I can figure out how to be something else, a little less hard around the edges. Because for the first time, I reckon I have got someone who will be there to catch me if I start to stumble." The two of them sat there in the quiet as the candle flame danced low, two souls who had been through the ringer and somehow found their way to each other in the aftermath. Tomorrow was going to be the fight of their lives, their futures. But for now, They had one another. And for the first time, that truly felt like it was enough. The courtroom carried the scent of aged wood and quiet desperation. Clara took a seat on a hard bench directly behind Nate. Her siblings gathered in close, a small wall of solidarity. Tommy's hand had been locked in hers since the moment they walked in. Sam was quiet, his face pale, while Josie stared intently at the floorboards. And then there was Emmy, who missed nothing, her gray eyes taking in every detail, mapping the exits, sizing up the opposition, and bracing for the worst outcome. Judge Elijah Crane entered and settled at the head of the room, his expression unreadable. He looked older than Clara had imagined, with a full head of silver hair and a face etched with the lines of countless difficult judgments. His gaze swept deliberately across the courtroom, absorbing the tension in the air. "This court is now in session," he announced, his voice soft but clear. "We are here to address the custody of 5 children, all minors, who are currently in the care of Mr. Nathaniel Harland. Reverend Jonas Cutter has filed a petition to place these children under the church's supervision until they can be adopted. Mr. Harland is contesting this." Cutter was seated at a table, a lawyer in a fine suit by his side. He appeared serene and self-assured, a man utterly convinced of his own righteousness. Nate sat at the opposing table, all by himself. He had turned down a lawyer, saying he could not afford to place his faith in the words of a stranger. In the gallery, Kate Mercer sat with Miss Patterson, Margaret Brennan, and about a dozen other folks from town who had come to lend their support. It did not feel like it was enough. Clara was certain it was not enough. "Reverend Cutter," Judge Crane began, "you may state your case." The Reverend rose, carefully smoothing the front of his black coat. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward issue of common decency and the welfare of these children. Mr. Harland, while well off, is a single man with absolutely no experience in raising a family. He resides by himself on a distant ranch without a wife or any female figure to help guide these young girls into womanhood." He paused, allowing his words to settle in the silent room. "Furthermore, Mr. Harland came to have these children through highly irregular methods. He paid $250 at a public placement event, effectively buying them as if they were cattle. That is not an adoption, Your Honor. It is a business transaction, and business has no place in the sacred duty of raising a child." Clara's hands balled into tight fists at her side. Tommy let out a small whimper next to her. "The church can give these children a structured life, a proper education, and moral teaching. We operate facilities built for young people who have been orphaned. We employ a trained staff that understands their specific needs." Cutter's voice was slick with false sincerity. "Mr. Harland, regardless of his intentions, is simply not equipped to give these children what they need." Judge Crane gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Mr. Harland, your turn to speak." Nate got to his feet. His hands were perfectly still, but Clara could see the rigid line of his shoulders. "Your Honor, I am not going to stand here and act like I have all the answers. When I walked onto that stage 3 weeks ago, I did not have a thought-out plan. I just saw 5 kids who were about to be scattered to the winds by people who wanted to exploit them, and I knew I could not turn my back." He stopped for a moment, composing himself. "The Reverend is correct that I am a bachelor. He is correct that I live by myself. And he is correct that I paid money to bring these children to my home. But he is entirely wrong about what it all means." "Explain yourself," the judge said. "I did not buy children, Your Honor. I bought them a chance to stay together. A chance to avoid being sold off to different homes that viewed them as cheap labor instead of as people. A chance to escape a system that handles orphans like they are nothing more than merchandise." Nate's voice grew firm. "I know what becomes of children placed through the Reverend's program. They are worked to the bone on farms. They are punished harshly for the smallest errors. And there are worse things. Things I will not say in this courtroom." Cutter leaped from his chair. "Objection! Those are completely unfounded accusations. Sit down, Reverend. Judge Crane's voice was like ice. You will get your opportunity to speak. Mr. Harland, please go on. I do not have a wife, Nate admitted freely. But I do have Mrs. Agnes Whitmore, who has managed my home for 15 years and has raised 3 children of her own. I have Kate Mercer, my next-door neighbor, who has come over every single day to help with the children's schooling. I have a whole town of people. He motioned toward the gallery. A community that has stepped up to help these children, even when the Reverend tried to poison them against us. He then turned his gaze toward Clara and her siblings. And I have 5 of the most courageous, tough, and determined individuals I have ever had the honor to meet. They do not need me to rescue them. They have rescued themselves more than 100 times over. All I'm doing is giving them a safe harbor to continue doing just that. Judge Crane remained quiet for a very long time. Finally, he spoke. I want to hear from the children. Clara's heart felt like it stopped beating. Your Honor, Cutter cut in, you cannot possibly intend to take the testimony of children over that of adults. I can, and I will, the judge stated, his stare sharp and direct. It is their lives we are deciding here. They have a right to be heard. He then looked directly at Clara. You are the oldest, are you not? Clara Mae Dawson? Clara rose to her feet on unsteady legs. Yes, sir. Please come forward. She made her way to the front of the courtroom, aware of every single person watching her. As she passed Nate, he offered a small, reassuring nod that conveyed trust and encouragement. She settled into the witness chair, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. Miss Dawson, Judge Crane began, please tell me about your life before you met Mr. Harland. Clara swallowed hard. I had a mother and a father once. My dad worked at a printing press in Boston. My mom sewed clothes for a living. They were good, kind people. What became of them? My father's arm was caught in one of the machines. It was crushed. And he died from the infection 2 weeks later. Clara's voice was steady, carefully controlled. My mother was not able to earn enough to take care of us on her own. She became ill. The fever claimed her 6 months after Papa was gone. And after that? We were sent to St. Catherine's orphanage. For 2 years, I shared a bed with 3 other girls. We ate meals that were mostly water. And every single day, we were reminded that we were a nuisance, a charity case, and that we should just be grateful to be alive. The judge's face remained neutral, but a brief emotion flickered in his eyes. Then we were put on a train and brought out west. They promised us we would find good families and new homes. What we found were auctions, where men would poke and inspect us like we were livestock. And Reverend Cutter, she paused, taking a steadying breath, Reverend Cutter told us we should feel thankful that anyone would want us at all. And what about Mr. Harland? Clara looked over at Nate, truly seeing him in that moment. Mr. Harland did not poke at us. He did not ask about how much work we could handle or if we would be trouble. He just asked if we wanted to go with him. He gave us a choice. Her voice trembled just a little. No one had ever offered us a choice before. Has he treated you well? He has been more than good. He stays with my little brother when he has nightmares. He gives my sister Emmy the quiet space she needs instead of demanding she act grateful all the time. He's even learning how to braid Josie's hair, just because he saw how much she missed it. He is, Clara searched for the right words, he is trying. He tries so hard, every day, and that is more than any other person has ever done for us. Thank you, Miss Dawson. Judge Crane then looked at Cutter. She is your witness. The Reverend stood, a predatory smile on his face. Miss Dawson, you are quite well spoken for a 10-year-old girl. One might even think your words have been rehearsed. No one rehearsed me. Of course not, Cutter said as he moved closer. Tell me, has Mr. Harland ever told you the real reason he took you all in? A rich, single man with no children of his own who suddenly decides to take on 5 of them. Does that not strike you as odd? He told us about his brother, Daniel, the one who was lost in the snow. A flicker of surprise crossed Cutter's face. He clearly had not anticipated that answer. So, you do know that Mr. Harland has a history of loss, of failure. He was unable to save his own brother, and now he is attempting to soothe his guilty conscience by playing the hero for you poor children. Clara's anger began to rise. That is not true, is it not? Is that not precisely what is happening here? A broken man using broken children to fix himself? No! Clara's voice was as hard as steel. What is happening is that a good man is trying to do a good thing. That is something you could never understand. I understand a great deal more than you think, child. Cutter leaned in, his voice low. I understand that you're defending him out of fear. You're afraid that if you speak the truth about what is really going on in that house, you will be sent right back into the system. Nothing is happening in that house. Clara was on her feet now, trembling with fury. Nothing but decency and patience and people who actually care if we wake up in the morning. You want to know what happens in houses? Then let's talk about the homes you found for other children, Reverend. Let's talk about the Miller farm, where Johnny Thompson lost 3 fingers to frostbite because they forced him to sleep in the barn. Let's talk about the Hendricks family, who struck Mary Sullivan so hard she could not walk for a week. Let's talk about— That is enough! Judge Crane's voice sliced through her rage. Miss Dawson, take your seat. Reverend Cutter, you will get your questions under control, or I will hold you in contempt of this court. Clara slowly sank back down, her entire body shaking. She had gone too far. She had wrecked their only chance. But when she dared to look at Judge Crane, she did not see anger in his eyes. She saw something else completely. I would like to hear from the other children now, he said, his voice calm, one by one. Sam was next. In a voice that was barely audible, he began to tell the judge about his fear of loud noises. How he started warning him before making any sudden noises. About how he finally felt safe for the first time since leaving Boston. Josie talked about all the books in the library and how Nate let her read whatever she wanted and never told her that girls should not fill their heads with stories. She talked about Mrs. Whitmore teaching her how to cook, and Kate Mercer lending her novels about brave women who went on adventures. Tommy could not stop crying long enough to say much of anything, but the way he clutched his tattered blanket and kept looking over at Nate spoke louder than any words. Then, it was Emmy's turn. She walked up to the witness chair like she was walking to her own hanging. She was so small and pale, her dark hair in a neat braid, her gray eyes staring at something far away. Miss Emmy, Judge Crane said kindly, do you have a last name? No, sir. I was left at the orphanage with no papers. They just called me Emmy. Do you remember anything at all about your life before the orphanage? Emmy was quiet for a long time. I remember a woman who had gray eyes, just like mine. I think she was my mother. And I remember a man talking about mountains, and about a ranch where the horses ran free. Clara saw Nate go completely still. But mostly, Emmy went on, I remember being alone and scared, and I learned that if you want to make it, you cannot trust a single soul. Has that changed? Emmy looked straight at Nate. Something passed between them, something like recognition or a deep connection. I am learning, she said softly. Mr. Harland does not make promises he cannot keep. He does not pretend that everything is all right when it is not. He tells the truth even when the truth is hard. She took a breath. I trust him. I do not trust very many people, but I trust him. Cutter stood up for his cross-examination, but you could see his confidence was starting to crack. Emmy, you said you do not remember your family. Is it not possible that Mr. Harlan has been manipulating your memories, that he convinced you to— Nobody manipulates me. Emmy's voice was like ice. I see things just as they are, probably clearer than most grown-ups. She turned those piercing gray eyes on Cutter. I see you, Reverend. I see what you really are. Oh? And what is that? A man who uses God's name as an excuse to hurt children. Emmy did not even blink. I have known men like you before. They smile and they talk real soft and they pretend to care, but deep down the only thing they care about is power and control, and making themselves feel big by making other people feel small. The whole courtroom fell dead silent. "I see you," Emmy said again, "and I am not afraid of you anymore." Judge Crane called for a recess. Clara found her brother and sisters in the hallway, all huddled together just like they had been at the auction. Nate was standing off by himself, talking, with Kate, his face looking pale and all drawn out. "Did I mess everything up?" Clara asked, stepping toward him. "Yelling like I did. You were downright spectacular." Nate pulled her into a sudden hug that caught them both off guard. "All of y'all were. No matter how this turns out, I'm proud of every one of you. What do you reckon will happen?" Nate gave no answer. He did not have to. The worry in his eyes told the whole story. An hour later, they all filed back inside the courtroom. Judge Crane returned to his chair, his face giving nothing away. "I have heard the testimony from both parties," he began. "I have gone over the papers provided by Reverend Cutter, and I have considered the character witnesses who spoke for Mr. Harlan. I have listened to 5 children tell their stories with an honesty and courage that is truly remarkable." He paused for a moment, letting the quiet hang heavy in the air. "Matters of custody are never easy. We have to weigh the children's well-being against the standards of society, religious beliefs, and what is practical. Reverend Cutter brings up some fair points about Mr. Harlan's rather unusual living arrangement." Clara felt her stomach drop right to the floor. "However," Judge Crane said, leaning forward, "I find myself deeply moved by the words of the children themselves. These are not little babies who can't make sense of what is happening to them. These are young people who have been through trials that would bring a grown man to his knees. They have come to their own solid conclusions about their lives, and their words carry real weight." He looked straight at Clara. "What's more, some things about the Reverend's petition just do not sit right with me. That original court order from Judge Whitfield has been thrown out while we investigate some questionable dealings in his court. Several children who were previously placed through the church's program have now shared some very troubling stories, and the territorial authorities are looking into them." The color drained right out of Cutter's face. "Mr. Harlan's ways might be a little out of the ordinary, but I see no proof that these children have been harmed. In fact, it is just the opposite. Every single person who spoke, including the children, talked about how much better their lives have become since he took them in." Judge Crane sat up tall in his chair. "For these reasons, this court has decided that the custody petition filed by Reverend Jonas Cutter is hereby denied. The 5 children, known as Clara Mae Dawson, Samuel Dawson, Josephine Bell, Thomas Reed, and Emmy, will stay right where they are, under the legal care of Nathaniel Harlan." Clara forgot how to breathe. "And another thing," the judge added, "I am strongly suggesting that the territorial authorities take a good long look into the placement practices of Reverend Cutter and all his affiliated groups. Until that investigation is finished, all of his operations are shut down." The whole courtroom just exploded. Folks were cheering, some were crying, others were shouting with joy. Cutter was on his feet, his face as red as a sunset, but his lawyer was already yanking him toward the back door. Arms came wrapping around Clara from her brothers and sisters, from Mrs. Whitmore, from Kate. And then Nate was right there, down on one knee before them, his eyes shining with tears he was fighting to hold back. "We won," Josie whispered. "We really, truly won." "That's right, we won," Nate confirmed. "Y'all are staying, for good." Tommy flew at Nate, throwing his little arms tight around his neck. Sam was right behind him, and then Josie. Even little Emmy shuffled closer, letting herself be gathered into the big hug. Clara held back for just a second, watching it all, daring herself to believe it was real. Then Nate's eyes found hers, and he reached out his hand. She finally took it. "Welcome home," he said, his voice thick. "This time for keeps." That party went on late into the night. Back at the ranch, Mrs. Whitmore had cooked up a spread fit for kings. Kate stayed for supper, and the way she sat next to Nate made you think they were more than just neighbors. The townspeople who had shown up at the trial came and went, bringing dishes of food, offering their good wishes, and saying they were sorry for all the years they had looked the other way and whispered behind their hands. Through it all, Clara just watched her family. Her real family, the one they had pieced together from all the broken parts. And she felt a strange new feeling settle deep in her chest. A feeling of peace. After the little ones were all tucked in bed, Clara found Nate out on the porch, just looking out over the land, all covered in snow. "Can't get to sleep?" she asked. "Got too much on my mind." She came and stood beside him, her eyes following his. The stars were something else that night, flung across the dark sky like a handful of diamonds. "Emmy asked me something a little while ago," Nate said softly. "She was asking about where she came from, if I knew something." Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. "And what did you say?" "The truth. Told her I got my suspicions, but nothing I can prove. That my brother Daniel, he was sweet on a girl from the Shoshone tribe. That the timing and her eyes, and 100 other little things, all point to something I just can't shake." "You reckon she is really his girl?" "Could be. Probably is." Nate's voice was gravelly. "And that would make her my niece, my own flesh and blood." "Does that change anything? You always said blood ain't what makes family." "It does not, but it matters to her. She needs to feel like she belongs somewhere, to somebody." He finally turned to look at Clara. "I told her it don't matter if we share blood or not, she belongs to me. All of them do. That is what counts." Clara nodded, taking it all in. "What did she say to that?" "She said that was good enough for her." A small smile touched Nate's lips. "Then she asked if she could still sleep in the barn some nights. Said being near the horses helps her feel safe." "Did you tell her yes?" "I told her she can do whatever she feels she needs to, long as she is home for supper." Model. They stood there quiet-like, feeling that sharp, cold air fill their lungs. "Kate's a nice woman," Clara finally said. Nate's face showed a flicker of something. "That she is, the way she looks at you, like you're somebody worth seeing. All I'm saying, Clara." Clara just shrugged her shoulders. "We wouldn't be bothered if you decided you didn't want to be lonesome in that way anymore." Nate was quiet for a good long while. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy. "One thing at a time. First, we got to get you kids settled proper. We need to figure out the truth of Emmy's story. Got to get Sam to where he can sleep through the night without a fuss. And we have to get Tommy to stop squirreling away food under his mattress." He let out a long breath. "He's still doing that. Old habits. They take a while to break, but we've got time now. All the time in the world." Clara leaned into him, just a little. He wrapped a steady arm around her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered, "for fighting for us. Thank you for letting me." They stayed right there until the cold finally chased them back inside. Two souls who'd found their way to each other against all odds. And for the very first time in Clara Mae Dawson's young life, the future wasn't something to be scared of. It felt like something you could hang your hopes on. Spring took its sweet time that year, melting the snow one stubborn inch at a time until patches of brown earth started showing through like little promises. Clara started to measure the seasons by the changes in her family. Tommy quit hiding food. That stopped sometime in February, right after Mrs. Whitmore found his stash and, instead of giving him a scolding, just started leaving a couple extra biscuits on his nightstand. Sam began talking in full sentences again, and his nightmares went from being a nightly terror to just a now-and-then trouble. Josie read every single book in Nate's library and then started writing her own stories, filling up notebooks with tales about brave orphans who found a place to call home. And Emmy. Well, Emmy just blossomed in ways none of them could have ever guessed. The real story of her past came out in little pieces, like a puzzle putting itself together. An old Shoshone woman who traded down at the general store saw something familiar in Emmy's face and started asking questions. Letters were written and sent off. Answers slowly made their way back. It turned out Daniel Harlan had truly loved a Shoshone girl named Morning Star. They had a plan to marry in secret and run off together to California, a place where folks wouldn't care about the color of a person's skin or the tribe of their people. But Daniel died in that blizzard before they ever had the chance. Morning Star, carrying his child and all alone, was sent away by her family out of shame. She died bringing a little girl with gray eyes and dark hair into the world. That baby girl was left at an orphanage by a distant relative who didn't have enough to feed another mouth. There were no papers, no name, just Emmy. Nate got the news while he was in his study, all by himself. Clara found him in there an hour later, just sitting in the dark with a crumpled letter clenched in his hand. "She's Daniel's," he said, not even looking up. "She's really his girl." "Does that change anything?" "Everything and nothing." Nate finally lifted his head, his eyes all red. "She's my kin, my own brother's child. The family I never thought I'd have. She was already your family." "I know," he said. Then he smoothed out the letter and stared at it. "But now I can give her a proper name, a history, something to belong to." They told Emmy the news together, sitting in the kitchen with the other children gathered close. Nate explained it all real careful, who Daniel was, who Morning Star was, and what happened to them both. Emmy just listened, her face showing nothing. When Nate was done, she was quiet for a long moment. "So I'm not a nobody," she said at last. "You were never a nobody. But now I know where I came from, who I came from." Emmy looked down at her own hand, so small and pale and trembling just a bit. "I have a grandmother, the old woman at the store. She said she knew my mother. She wants to meet you proper when you feel you're ready. I'm ready now." That meeting took place 3 days later. Clara watched from a little ways off as Emmy walked up to the old Shoshone woman. She watched as those weathered hands cupped Emmy's face, as tears fell from eyes that had seen more than their share of loss. "You have her spirit," the old woman said. "Morning Star. She was fierce, just like you. Quiet, but fierce." Emmy didn't cry. She never did. But she let that woman hold her. And that was more than she had let anyone do before. The adoption papers were all filed and signed in April. All 5 children were now legally and forever bound to Nathaniel Harlan. The very judge who had saved them, Elijah Crane, came to officiate the ceremony himself. "Raise your right hands," he said, with just a hint of a smile on his weathered face. 5 small hands went up in the air. Nate's went up too. "Do you, Nathaniel James Harlan, swear to provide for these children, to protect them, to guide them, and to love them as your own flesh and blood, for as long as you shall live?" "I do." "And do you, Clara May, Samuel, Josephine, Thomas, and Emmeline, accept Nathaniel Harlan as your father, to honor him, to trust him, and to allow him into your hearts as family?" Clara was the first to answer. "I do." The others followed, even little Tommy, after Josie gave him a gentle nudge. "Then, by the authority vested in me, I declare you a family, legally and—" Judge Crane's voice got a little softer. "Well deserved." Clara figured she would feel different afterward, maybe lighter or more whole. But instead, she just felt right, like a bone that had been out of place for years had finally clicked back where it belonged. Summer brought growth in all sorts of ways. The ranch was doing well under Nate's watch, but now there were little hands helping out. Sam was learning how to gentle the horses. Clara was riding the fence lines right alongside Nate. Even Tommy did his part, collecting eggs from the chicken coop Mrs. Whitmore swore they needed. Emmy split her days between the ranch and her grandmother's lodge, learning the words and the ways of her mother's people. She would come home every evening with new words on her tongue, new stories to tell, and new pieces of the person she was building herself up to be. And Kate Mercer started coming around more often. Her visits went from afternoons to evenings, and then to the occasional supper that turned into an overnight stay in the guest room. Clara saw it. They all did. But not a soul said a word about it until Josie, who was always as blunt as a hammer, asked over breakfast one morning, "Are you and Miss Kate fixin' to get married?" Nate nearly choked on his coffee. "Josie," Clara hissed. "What? It's a fair question. She's over here all the time. She looks at Papa the same way Mama used to look at our real Papa. And last week I saw them holding hands out in the barn." Kate, who had been helping Mrs. Whitmore with the dishes, went completely still. Nate set his coffee cup down with great care. "That's a conversation for the grown-ups. We're part of this family, too." Sam's voice was quiet, but it was firm. "If something's about to change, we ought to know about it." The silence in the room stretched on. Clara watched Nate and Kate give each other a look. The kind of look that said a whole lot without a single word being spoken. "You're right," Nate finally said, his voice low. "Y'all deserve to know." He reached a calloused hand across the table and covered Kate's. "Me and Kate, well, we've become more than just friends, more than neighbors." He paused, looking at each of them. "And I've asked her to be my wife." Tommy's eyes grew as wide as saucers. "Does that mean we're getting a mama?" Kate slid off her chair and knelt beside him, her face full of kindness. "Only if you want one, sweet boy. I could never take anyone's place, but I would surely love to be a part of this family, if you'll let me." Clara watched her brothers and sisters take in the news. Sam looked unsure, chewing on his lip. Josie was beaming. Tommy looked like he was about to burst into tears of joy. Amy's face was a perfect mask. "Clara," Nate said, his tone careful, "you're the oldest. What you think carries a lot of weight here." Clara's mind raced back over the last 6 months. She thought of Kate teaching her how to really handle a horse, helping her with schoolwork, and sitting with her through a bad dream when Nate was out on the range. She remembered the way Kate looked at them, not with pity like so many others, but with a real, honest warmth. "Do you love him?" she asked, looking Kate straight in the eye. "With all my heart." "And do you love us? All of us? Even when we're a handful?" "Especially when you're a handful," Kate answered with a gentle smile. "You are the most amazing children I have ever met. It would be the honor of my life to call you my own." Clara glanced at her siblings. A quiet look passed between them, a silent agreement. "All right then," she said, a small smile touching her own lips. "Welcome to the family." The wedding was a small affair held right there on the ranch as autumn painted the aspen leaves gold. Clara stood as the maid of honor, a title she had to have explained since she had never seen a wedding before. Sam and Tommy were up front with Nate, serving as his groomsmen. Josie walked down the simple, cleared path, scattering petals. Amy sat in the front row next to her grandmother, watching two families become one. Judge Crane was the one to marry them, making a joke about how he was becoming the Harlan family's official justice of the peace. Kate wore a lovely cream-colored dress that Mrs. Whitmore had helped her sew. Nate was in his best suit, the same one he had worn to the custody hearing, only now it held a much happier memory. When it was time for their vows, Clara saw something new. Tears were silently tracing paths down Nate's weathered cheeks. "I spent 25 years thinking I didn't deserve a lick of happiness," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I figured losing Daniel meant I had to walk through life alone, paying for a mistake that could never be undone. Then 5 kids tumbled into my world and showed me that family ain't about blood. It's about choosing each other, day in and day out." He looked from Kate to the children. "I choose y'all, all of you, for the rest of my days." The kiss they shared made Tommy let out a little giggle. Josie, meanwhile, sighed like she was in a storybook. Clara just smiled, a true, genuine smile she thought she had lost for good. The years that came after weren't always smooth. The nightmares still came back some nights. Tommy's fires, Sam's awful machines, Clara's auction blocks. There were arguments and the tough parts of growing up. and the natural rubbing and bumping of 7 lives learning to fit under one roof. There was the hard winter Josie came down with pneumonia so bad they were scared they would lose her. And there was the summer Sam took off after a bad fight with Nate, staying gone for 3 whole days. But alongside the hardship, there was joy, an ocean of it. Clara learned to read the land the way Nate did, to know a storm was coming by the color of the clouds, to feel the rhythm of the seasons and the herd. By 15, she could practically run the whole ranch by herself. By 17, she was making big decisions that shaped their future. Sam discovered his calling was with the animals. He had a way with horses that was something else, almost like he could hear what they were thinking. At 16, he was training horses for ranches all over the territory. The boy who used to jump at any loud sound could now stand in the middle of a spooked herd and bring a calm to them all. And Josie's stories finally found their way into the world. A publisher in Denver printed her first book of frontier tales when she turned 19, and just like that, the girl who lived in her imagination was sharing it with everyone. Instead of just devouring books, was now creating them. She wrote on the dedication page, "For Papa Nate, who taught me the best stories are the ones we actually live." Tommy shot up, growing tall and strong, and the fears from his childhood were slowly replaced by a fierce need to protect his family. He stuck to Nate like a shadow, soaking up every lesson the older man had to give. He was determined to carry on the Harland name. And Emmy, well, Emmy became the heart connecting 2 different worlds. She gracefully moved between the ranch and the Shoshone community, speaking both languages without a hitch. She taught her siblings the old traditions of their mother's people, all while holding on to the heritage of her father. The quiet little girl who once terrified grown men with a kitchen knife had blossomed into a young woman of incredible grace and silent strength. Kate brought twins into the world when Clara was 16. A boy they named Daniel, and a little girl named Rose. All of a sudden, 2 more Harlands were in the house, and the older kids found out fast they had strong opinions on changing diapers and late-night feedings. "This is on you," Clara told Nate one bone-tired morning, after 3 hours of pacing with a screaming Rose. "You wanted a big family." Nate just smiled and took Rose from her, calming the baby like it was second nature. "I wanted you 5. The rest was just a bonus. Besides, you love them." Clara gazed down at her tiny half-sister who was finally asleep and felt her heart swell in a way she never knew it could. "Yeah," she admitted softly. "I really do." The day Clara had been silently dreading finally arrived on her 18th birthday. A law firm in Denver had offered her a position. Judge Crane himself had put in a good word, saying she had the sharpest legal mind he'd come across in his 40 years on the bench. The firm was willing to pay for her schooling and train her. Eventually, she would practice right alongside them. It was a dream she had never been bold enough to even consider. It was also 800 long miles from her home. She found Nate out in the barn, brushing down his favorite horse, the same thing he always did when he had something heavy on his mind. "You heard," she said, not as a question. "Kate told me." He kept on brushing, not missing a stroke. "Denver's a fine opportunity. I do not have to go." "Yes, you do." He finally stopped and turned to look her straight in the eye. "Clara, you have been looking after other people since you were just 8 years old. First, it was your brothers and sisters, then this entire family. It is about time you started looking after yourself. But the ranch needs you. The ranch has Sam and Tommy and Emmy and Kate and me. We will be just fine." His voice got a little softer. "This is what I always wanted for you. For all of you. Not just to survive, but to have a real life. A life filled with choices and chances and a future that you get to build with your own 2 hands. Clara felt the sting of tears welling up. "What if I fail? Then you come right back home, and we will figure something else out together." Nate walked across the barn and took both of her hands into his. "Clara May Harlan, you are the single bravest person I have ever had the privilege to know. You stood up to men twice your size to protect your family. You got on a stand and testified against a corrupt preacher in a court of law. You held this family together through trials that would have shattered anyone else. He gave her hands a gentle squeeze. Denver does not stand a chance against you. She left that September on a train headed east into the mountains. The entire family turned out to see her off. There was Nate and Kate, Mrs. Whitmore and Dan, all four of her siblings, and even the twins who were strapped to Kate's chest. Emmy's grandmother had sent along a blessing bundle, which now hung from Clara's travel bag. Josie was crying openly. Tommy tried his best not to, but he could not stop the tears. Sam pulled her into a hug so tight she thought her ribs might just crack. Emmy just rested her forehead against Clara's and whispered, "Come back strong. Come back soon." Nate was the last one. "I am proud of you," he said quietly, his voice so low that only she could hear him. "I have been proud of you from the very second you slapped that farmer's hand away at the auction. But today, watching you choose your own path, choosing to become something more than anyone ever thought you could be, this is the proudest I have ever been. Papa." The word still felt a little new on her tongue, even after all these years of practice. "I would not be here if it was not for you. Yes, you would. You would just be somewhere different. Someone was always going to see the fire in you, Clara. I just count myself lucky that I was the first one." The train whistle let out a long cry. Clara hugged him one final time, breathing in the familiar smell of leather and horses and home. Then she stepped up onto the train, found her seat, and watched out the window as her family got smaller and smaller, until the train curved around a bend, and they were gone. She did not shed a tear. She was far too busy picturing her future. 20 years down the road, Clara Harlan stood tall in a Denver courtroom, staring down a factory owner who had been working children to death in his textile mill. She thought of Tommy, who had taken over the ranch and was raising it to incredible new heights. She thought of Sam, whose horse training business now reached across 3 states. She thought of Josie, who was a famous author living in New York City with a husband and 4 children of her own. She thought of Emmy, who had become a teacher on the reservation, building bridges between 2 cultures. She thought of Nate, older now, with a full head of white hair and hands that were not as steady, but his heart was just the same. She thought of Kate, a grandmother to 14, who still ran the household with a quiet, steady hand. She thought of Daniel and Rose, all grown up and making their own way in the world. Her mind went back 30 years to a bitter winter day, when a little 10-year-old girl stood on an auction platform and fought grown men to keep her family in one piece. When a broken-down rancher had stepped out from the crowd and changed her entire world with just 2 words. How much? She thought about what it truly meant to be chosen, to be wanted, and to be loved, not because of family ties or some duty, but simply because someone looked at you and saw something that was worth saving. The factory owner's attorney was still talking, going on and on about profit margins and economic necessity. Clara patiently let him finish his speech, and then she rose to her feet. "Your Honor, my opponent talks about economic necessity. He talks about the practical realities of running a business in this modern world." Her voice was calm and steady, and it filled the entire room. "But I am here to speak for 27 children who worked 14-hour days in conditions that would make a prison look decent. I am here to speak for the 3 who died because safety equipment was considered too expensive to install. I am here to speak for every single child who has ever been told they are less than human just because they are small and powerless and have no one to stand up and fight for them." She looked directly at the factory owner and saw him flinch. "My client is not just here for money. She is here seeking recognition. Recognition that children are human beings, not pieces of machinery. That their lives have value far beyond the work they can be forced to do. That in this country, in this century, we can do better than treating our most vulnerable people like they are disposable." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. "I was an orphan once. sold off in the middle of a Wyoming winter to whoever was willing to pay for me. I know exactly what it feels like to be seen as nothing more than property. And I also know what it feels like to be saved by someone who simply refused to look away. Her voice grew stronger. We cannot look away. Not now. Not ever again. The jury came back with a verdict in her favor. They always did. Clara made her way back to Wyoming for Christmas that year, just like she did every year. The train pulled into the station as the sun was setting, and her whole family was there on the platform waiting for her. A gray-haired Nate was leaning on Kate's arm. Tommy's kids were running around like wild things. Sam's quiet wife was holding their newborn baby. Josie was surrounded by her own loud and happy bunch. Emmy stood just a little off to the side, with her grandmother's blessing bundle still hanging from her belt after all this time. "You won again," Nate said as she stepped down from the train. "I saw it in the papers." "I learned from the best," she teased. But he was smiling. It was that rare, genuine smile that she had come to cherish so much. "Come on." Mrs. Whitmore's granddaughter made dinner for us. Turkey with all the trimmings. They all walked together toward the wagons, 3 generations of Harlans spilling out across the platform. Clara looked at her family, the one she had been born into and then lost, the one she had pieced back together from broken shards, and the one that had grown and multiplied and spread out across the country like the roots of a mighty oak tree seeking water. She thought about that scared little girl she had once been. The girl who had believed that hope was a dangerous thing, that good things were never meant to last, and that love was just another word for a loss that was sure to come. That little girl had been wrong. "Papa," she said, slipping her hand into Nate's weathered and familiar one. "Thank you for stepping forward that day, for not just walking away." Nate squeezed her hand, and his eyes, still the same kind shade of gray, met hers. "Thank you for letting me." They all climbed up into the wagon, completely surrounded by family, and headed home through the falling snow. And Clara May Harlan, the girl who had once stood on an auction platform and whispered that nobody wanted her, finally understood the simple truth that had been waiting for her all this time. She had never been unwanted. She had simply been waiting for the right person to see her worth. And when he finally came along, he did not just save her life. He gave her the courage to build a life that was worth living. That was the real gift that Nathaniel Harlan had given to 5 broken children on a cold winter day in Wyoming. It was not just a home, and it was not just a name. It was the unshakable, deeply rooted knowledge that they mattered, that they belonged, and that somewhere in this wide and often cruel world there was a place for them, a family, forever and always. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.